Now here let's introduce the actual pump, the heart, that is pretty much the main player in this system. There are two different kinds of circulations that the heart is responsible for pumping blood through. The whole circulation is a closed loop. Okay, again, if there were any openings in these tubes, then that would lead to bleeding. So all of the arteries and capillaries and everything, all of these form what is known as a closed loop, where we start in the heart, the blood circulates, and then it'll end up back into the heart. But there are two main circulations. The first one is the pulmonary circulation. It's a very short circuit where that starts in the right side of the heart, so the right ventricle, and then the deoxygenated blood would get pumped by the right ventricle through the pulmonary arteries into the lungs. That, again, it was deoxygenated blood. The lungs will, in the lungs, the blood will pick up oxygen and release all of the carbon dioxide. Now that oxygenated blood will go back and will be drained through 4 pulmonary veins, and all of those veins are going to drain into the left atrium. So the pulmonary circulation, again, mainly carries the oxygen poor blood, or the deoxygenated blood, from the right ventricle to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen and dumps the carbon dioxide, and then it returns back to the left atrium through the pulmonary veins. Now the systemic circulation, that is the bigger circulation. Now that the blood has become oxygenated, the left ventricle will pump all of that oxygenated blood to all of the tissues of the body. The tissues are going to use the oxygen, so there will be an exchange of gas at the tissue level, where the tissues get oxygen and get rid of their waste products like carbon dioxide. And then that deoxygenated blood will return back to the heart, to the right atrium. Okay, so again, the systemic circulation carries oxygen-rich blood to the body, and part of that loop will be returned, after using all of that oxygen, that deoxygenated blood would have to go back to the heart and will be dumped into the right atrium. So blood vessels, how do we identify a blood vessel as an artery or a vein? And what are the different kinds of blood vessels that we have? So any blood vessel that takes blood away from the heart is an artery. Okay, so with A, that's an easy way to remember it. Any blood vessel that is going to carry blood away from the heart is going to be an artery, while veins are blood vessels that carry blood towards the heart. So regardless of whether the blood is oxygenated or deoxygenated, again, we name the blood vessels according to the direction of flow of blood, not according to the kind of blood that it's carrying. So although we tend to color code arteries as red because they're oxygenated and veins because they're deoxygenated, well, that holds true for the majority of the blood vessels in the body, but there are exceptions to that. So you see the pulmonary arteries, for example, carry deoxygenated blood, but because, again, we're carrying the blood away from the heart, we are going to name this a pulmonary artery. While the blood vessels that bring oxygenated blood towards the heart, this is going to be named a pulmonary vein because of the direction of flow, not because of the content of the blood vessel. Okay, so again, there are some exceptions to that. Now, this is the distribution of the 5 liters of blood that we have. How does the body distribute the 5 liters of blood to the different organs? I don't expect you to know these numbers. You don't have to do that, but it is important to understand that you'll find, for example, the brain takes about 15% of our blood. The skeletal muscles is about 20%. Kidneys which are these tiny organs in the abdomen, those alone get about 20% of our blood. The abdominal organs, about a quarter of our blood at any given time. But, and that's the importance of these numbers, is that these numbers can change. So according to the situation, so let's say you're studying, you're in an exam, that 13% of blood might not be enough at that point. So the body has the ability to dilate the blood vessels going to the brain. So now the brain will get more blood. Well, where would that blood come from? Well, it could come from maybe the skeletal muscles. Okay, skeletal muscles don't need at that point all 20%. Okay, so we can constrict, the body will constrict the blood vessels going to the muscles to divert that blood away from the muscle and direct it towards the brain. Okay, so that is the importance of this thing, that these numbers are not constant. They're changing throughout the day depending on the circumstances. Another example, if somebody's exercising, at that point, again, abdominal organs definitely don't need all 25% of our blood. The body will constrict those blood vessels, divert some of that blood towards the skeletal muscles. Okay, so we can do that. We can constrict and dilate the blood vessels. The heart can pump stronger in order to change or to speed up the delivery of blood. And that's what we're going to talk about here in blood flow. Blood flow, by definition, is the volume of blood that is moved per unit time. And we measure that in the terms of milliliters of blood per minute. The blood flow, is directly proportionate to the difference in pressure, but inversely proportionate to resistance. So let's understand what all of these terms mean. Pressure in the blood, the pressure that pushes or forces the blood to go through the blood vessels, is the hydrostatic pressure. Okay, and that hydrostatic pressure is due to the heart pumping blood. Okay, and that is what gives the blood, again, that force in order for it to go through the blood vessels. Okay, and we measure that in millimeters mercury. So hydrostatic pressure, the more hydrostatic pressure, or the stronger the heart contracts, that means that the flow would be more. Okay, and that is why we say that flow is directly proportionate to the hydrostatic pressure. But resistance, that's a little bit different. Resistance is performed by the blood vessels. The more friction on the blood vessels, so for example, if the blood vessels constrict, that is going to lead to higher resistance, which means that the blood flow is going to decrease. When you dilate the blood vessels, on the other hand, that decreases the resistance. That means that more blood will be able to go in. Okay, so the more you increase resistance, you decrease the blood flow. Obviously, if the pressure is constant, if the pressure remains the same. So all of these kind of hold true. These, the physics holds true when it comes to the heart. So again, the blood flow is directly proportionate to the hydrostatic pressure or change in hydrostatic pressure, and inversely proportionate to resistance. So what are the factors that change the resistance or determine resistance to blood flow? There is the blood viscosity, so how thick or thin is that blood? Okay, obviously this is going to be determined by how much blood or how much water there is in the blood, how many RBCs, or so the RBC count and the hematocrit value. All of these affect blood viscosity. The more RBCs in there, the more thick, the more viscous the blood is. That means more friction. That means lower flow. Okay, so blood viscosity, which is the function of the friction between the molecules of a flowing fluid. So as that blood flows through these blood vessels, if it's thicker, there will be more resistance to flow. There's also the total blood vessel length. So forget about blood vessels for a minute and kind of think of a hose in the backyard. And you have that hose attached to a spigot and you turn on the water. Okay, if you have a short hose, the power of water coming out of that hose is going to be high. So you have a high blood flow. But if you have a very long hose, okay, the force of water coming out on the other end of the hose is going to be a lot less. So it really depends on the blood vessel length. So you will find blood vessels that are shorter. For example, the carotids, which are in the neck, those have pressure that is higher as opposed to the blood vessels in the lower limb. Those have lower pressures. Okay, so again, it depends on the length of that blood vessel. Shorter blood vessels have higher pressure, while longer blood vessels will eventually have lower pressure. Now, the inside radius of the tube, meaning do the blood vessels constrict or dilate? And that is really the main determinant of resistance. So blood viscosity might change, but it takes a while. Total blood vessel length is constant. But what we can change pretty much instantaneously would be the radius of the tube, the radius of the blood vessel, dilation versus constriction. So again, dilation will decrease the resistance to flow, meaning more blood will come in to the organ. But if you constrict the blood vessel, that means that you've increased the resistance to flow. That will decrease the amount of blood going to that organ. Now here's a diagrammatic section of the flow inside of the flow of blood inside of the heart. So we mentioned that all of the blood is going, obviously it's a cycle, but in order to start the cycle, I'm going to go ahead and start it at the right atrium. The right atrium is going to collect all of the deoxygenated blood from the body. It'll get blood from the superior vena cava, bringing in the deoxygenated blood from the upper half of the body. The inferior vena cava brings in the deoxygenated blood from the lower half of the body. And then there's a little tiny opening known as the opening of the coronary sinus that is not really showing in here, but that brings the deoxygenated blood from the actual heart. Now that blood will be pumped down into the right ventricle. It would have to pass through the tricuspid valve. It has 3 cusps. That's where the name comes from. And then from the right ventricle, it gets pushed into or pumped into the pulmonary artery. This is the pulmonary trunk that divides into the 2 pulmonary arteries, goes to the lungs, and gets oxygenated. Now that oxygenated blood will come back through these 1, 2, 3, 4 pulmonary veins and drain that oxygenated blood into the left atrium. From the left atrium, it gets pumped down into the left ventricle, passing through the mitral valve. From the left ventricle, it'll eventually be pumped into the aorta, passing through the aortic valve, and then, from there, it'll be distributed throughout the whole body. One valve that I just forgot to mention is the pulmonary valve that, again, regulates the passage of blood from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk. The heart has 3 different layers. Okay, so the epicardium, that is the most superficial layer, and that is the visceral pericardium. Okay, it's a very shiny layer. It is literally attached to the heart. It's extremely hard to peel off. The myocardium, these are the actual cardiac muscle fibers, and those are the muscle fibers that are going to perform the contractions and perform the systolic contractions that are going to eventually push blood and pump blood into the different areas. Okay, so that's the layer that actually contracts. On the inside, there is a layer known as the endothelium. Okay, again, it's a very shiny layer. It is continuous with the inner layers of the blood vessels. So when we talk about the blood vessels, we'll mention that the inner layer of the blood vessels are also known as the endothelium, and they are, again, continuous with the endothelium of the heart. The cardiac muscle fibers are arranged in different ways. They actually are arranged kind of like they're twisted around the heart. And that helps the squeezing of heart out of the different chambers. Okay, so when we fill up the heart, kind of like a balloon, when it's filled up with blood, in order to squeeze all of the blood out of the chambers, we want the cardiac muscles to not just contract, but literally squeeze the blood out. Okay, we contract the heart about 3 billion times in an average lifespan without resting, and this actually starts in utero. Okay, so not, this includes like in utero as well. Average lifespan is very different, obviously, due to different factors, but here in the U.S., it is in the 70s, depending again on gender and background and so on. Unfortunately, the human heart cells, the myocytes, which are the cardiac muscle cells, we don't have the ability to replace them. Okay, and that's why if somebody gets a heart attack and some of the tissue dies, we really have an extremely limited ability to reproduce and to make new muscle cells. So about every year, there's approximately 1% of heart muscle cells that are replaced. So it's a very, very slow process. Now for the blood supply of the heart. So the heart doesn't actually depend on the fact that it's full of blood and just kind of suck the oxygen out of from the blood directly. It has its own blood supply, and those arteries are known as the coronary arteries. And they are the very first two branches that branch off of the aorta. So the heart is a very smart organ, and what it does is that it has to take care of itself and provide itself with oxygen before it can take care of the other organs. So again, the first two branches off of the aorta would be the coronary arteries. And then, so we have a right and a left coronary artery that will branch off, provide oxygen for the muscle, and then, just like any other organ, we have to gather now this deoxygenated blood that will gather all of that, or all of the cardiac veins are going to drain into this large pool of venous blood known as the coronary sinus. And that coronary sinus will eventually dump all of that deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. And I kind of put these pictures to illustrate that. So you can see here, that right here is the arch of the aorta. And again, the first two branches that come out would be your right coronary and the left coronary, and then it starts to branch out. And then the venous blood is all gathered into this coronary sinus, this kind of lake of venous blood, and the coronary sinus opens up into the right atrium to dump all of that deoxygenated blood. And just like any organ, heart has its own innervation. It is under the autonomic nervous system control. So there's both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers reaching the heart. The sympathetic fibers stimulate the heart, and parasympathetic inhibits the heart. The sympathetic fibers going to the heart actually innervate the whole heart. So it innervates the SA node, the AV node, and the ventricles. It releases the sympathetic nerves, postganglionic nerves release norepinephrine, and the receptors on the heart are beta adrenergic receptors. Okay, and because they are beta adrenergic receptors, the hormone epinephrine, remember that hormone that comes out of the adrenal medulla, it has the exact same effect on the heart as would the sympathetic nervous system. When you compare that to the parasympathetic fibers will stimulate or innervate pretty much just the atrium, maybe AV node, but there is no parasympathetic supply to the ventricles. These parasympathetic fibers release acetylcholine, and the receptors on the heart for acetylcholine are muscarinic receptors. And you can see in this image how atria and ventricles both are getting sympathetic supply. The postganglionic sympathetic to the heart will release norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter, and the receptors on the heart are beta adrenergic receptors, which again can be stimulated by epinephrine coming from the adrenal medulla. On the parasympathetic end, though, and those will be carried on the vagus nerve, you will find that the parasympathetic nerves will supply the atria, AV node, but not to the ventricles. The receptors are muscarinic cholinergic receptors that are stimulated by acetylcholine released by the parasympathetic fibers. Now in this next portion, or in the next tutorial, we will be discussing EKG.